Your generous support makes this ministry possible. Thank you.
Okay, now let's go back to our discussion of the Abrahamic covenant. Last class I was hurrying through certain things as we were going over the definition of a covenant and the details of the promises in the Abrahamic covenant, because those are some things that are fairly factual. We're getting into the discussion of some of the important issues. What do we need to show, first of all, about the Abrahamic covenant? That it's unconditional. That's where we are now. And if you have questions or have discussion points here, feel free to look at this. We need to make sure that we understand not only what we are believing, but why. Why do you believe that? Okay, I am arguing that the Abrahamic covenant is an unconditional covenant. What was my first argument? My only argument last class. God put the obligations on himself. Where do you get that? Huh? From the ceremony of the ratification of the covenant. What in that ceremony of ratification in Genesis 15 shows that the obligations were all on God's side and not God and Abraham? What shows that? When you had the animals cut and passing through the animals, it was only God, there in the symbolic form, that passed between the two animals. Abraham was a passive observer of this. He was asleep, he was seeing this in a dream or in a vision, and it was only God who passed through, indicating that he was taking the obligations for the fulfillment of the covenant upon himself. That's the first argument. Now, there are 4 other arguments that I want you to notice. Now, the second argument is that when you read the passages that relate to the Abrahamic covenant, what's the first central passage on the Abrahamic covenant? Genesis 12. Go to the next chapter, Genesis 13. There is a repetition of the covenant with some additional features. Genesis 15, Genesis 17, Genesis 22. Read all of those passages. And I would suggest that when you read those passages, you will not find any conditions stated in the covenant. Rather, this is a covenant in which God says, this is what I am going to do. It does not say, if you do this, then this is what I will do. So the second argument is that there are no conditions stated in the Abrahamic covenant. Now, a footnote to this discussion relates to Genesis 12:1. Remember what God said in Genesis 12:1? Now the Lord said to Abram, go forth from your country and from your relatives and from your father's house to the land which I will show you. There is a discussion among premillennialists as to whether that verse is a condition. Was that a condition for Abraham, for him to fulfill in order for God to fulfill his promises in the Abrahamic covenant? Now, I think that some of this discussion is a little bit of an academic discussion without a whole lot of significance. If that was a condition, get out of your country, from your father's house to the land that I will show you. Did Abraham do that? Well, if he did it, then everything that is stated following that should be part of the things that God has said that he will do. So if it is a condition, then Abraham fulfilled it. And so all of the rest of the things that God has promised must be fulfilled. The way I would look at Genesis 12:1 is really that this is an example in God's working out his plan of salvation. This is an example of the sovereign call of God. This was God, the sovereign God, calling Abraham to himself and to get out of his pagan country. And the God who called him also led him, enabled him, made him willing to do that, so that God might fulfill all of his plan or establish all of his plan of salvation. So I think that this is the combination of the sovereign call of God and the human response of man that we have in the whole process of salvation as it is outlined in the New Testament, where you have election and calling and the response of faith. All of those work together in God's plan. So my second argument is, look at the passages. You do not find any conditions stated. Third argument. It is called an eternal covenant. It is called an eternal covenant. We have this several times in Genesis 17. In verse 7 of Genesis 17, I will establish my covenant between me and you and your descendants after you throughout their generations for an everlasting covenant, to be God to you and to your descendants after you. Now, what does that mean? It is an everlasting covenant. It's an eternal covenant. God has made some promises. If this is an eternal covenant, there can be delays before some of the promises are fulfilled. There may be postponements. There can be chastisements for disobedience. But if this is an eternal covenant, then it cannot be abrogated. It cannot be broken. It cannot be annulled. This covenant and the promises in the covenant have to be fulfilled. If God would abrogate the covenant right now, the Abrahamic covenant, the people of the children of Israel, the natural seed of Israel, they've been disobedient. God says, because of your disobedience, I'm ending this covenant. God would be going back on his word. He would not be faithful to his promises, because he has said this is an eternal covenant. If the covenant comes to end, what? It's not eternal, right? So it is called an eternal covenant. You with me? Fourth argument. What is supposed to annul the promises? What is supposed to annul the promises? If you have disobedience, violation of the covenant, if you have apostasy, if Israel is disobedient and apostate. Now, the fourth argument is this, that even at the times of the greatest apostasy in the nation of Israel, the Abrahamic covenant was not annulled. Even Israel's disobedience and apostasy did not annul the covenant. Now I want you to look at two passages, one in the New Testament and one in the Old Testament. The New Testament passage is Romans chapter 3. Now, I like these verses because I like everything in the book of Romans. Now, look at Romans chapter 3. Paul asks this question. What is the advantage of the Jew? Or what is the benefit of circumcision? What is the advantage of the Jew? What is the benefit of circumcision? Now, you'll notice, Paul is not asking what was the benefit for being a Jew in Old Testament times. He is asking what now, as he is writing this book, what is the advantage of being a Jew? Now, if you held to replacement theology, what is that? That the church has taken the place of Israel. Because of Israel's disobedience, they have been rejected. The church has now taken their place. What would you say the answer to this question was? What is the advantage of the Jew today? You'd say none, wouldn't you? What's Paul's answer? Great in every respect. He says that there is still an advantage for being a Jew today. Now, what is that advantage? It says, first of all, and he doesn't tell what is second, but he's like a preacher that takes so long on his first point that he doesn't get to his second. He's actually going to tell us what some of the other points are in Romans chapter 9. But first of all, he says they were entrusted with the oracles of God. Now, when he says that they were entrusted with the oracles of God, he is referring here to the messianic promises. He's referring to the promises that are found in the Old Testament, in the covenants. And that is why I am coming to this passage as we are discussing the Abrahamic covenant. It refers to those promises, the oracles that God gave in those covenants, of which the Abrahamic covenant is the foundational covenant. So he says they were entrusted with the oracles of God. But look at verse 3. What then if some did not believe? Is their unbelief going to nullify the promises? Do you see what he says here? What if some did not believe? Their unbelief will not nullify the faithfulness of God, will it? Even Israel's unbelief did not nullify God's promises and his faithfulness to keeping his promises. Verse 4, may it never be, but let God be found true, even though every man is a liar. In other words, God must keep his promises that he has made to the nation of Israel. Now, think about the context here. When is Paul saying this? What has happened? Do you know what John 1:11 is? It's before the verse, but as many as received him. John 1:11? Yeah. He came to his own, and his own did not receive him. At his first coming, what was the response of the nation of Israel to their Messiah? They did not receive him. They rejected him. Acts chapter 2 and Acts chapter 3 in Peter's sermons there have some very strong language. I'm just going to refer to Acts chapter 3 and verse 13. He says, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of our fathers, has glorified his servant Jesus. Now listen, the one that you delivered up and disowned in the presence of Pilate when he decided to release him. But you disowned the holy and righteous one and asked for a murderer to be granted to you, but put to death the Prince of Life, the one whom God raised from the dead, a fact to which we are witnesses. What is he saying here? He came to his own. He came to the nation of Israel. They rejected him. They crucified him. And yet, Paul is saying, in spite of this, can you imagine any greater act of apostasy and rejection of God than to reject his son? In spite of this, what does Paul say? What is the advantage of the Jew? There are the promises, the oracles of God, the promises of God that have not been fulfilled, and they still must be fulfilled because God cannot go back on his word. So our argument here is that even apostasy does not nullify the promises of the Abrahamic covenant. Now that's a New Testament passage. There's an Old Testament passage, very interesting passage. It's the New Covenant passage. What's our central passage for the New Covenant in the Old Testament? Jeremiah 31. What verse? 31. It's easy to remember. If you can remember the chapter, it's Jeremiah 31:31. Now, you have God saying, I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. After saying that in verses 31 to 34, he says in verse 35, thus says the Lord, who gives the sun for light by day and the fixed order of the moon and the stars for light by night, who stirs up the sea so that its waves roar. The Lord of hosts is his name. Now listen, if this fixed order, stars in the sky, sunrise every day, right? That's the fixed order. If this fixed order departs from before me, declares the Lord, then the offspring of Israel also shall cease from being a nation before me forever. That's when Israel is going to be cast aside by the Lord. Thus says the Lord, if the heavens above can be measured and the foundations of the earth searched out below, then I will cast off all the offspring of Israel for all that they have done, declares the Lord. When did he say this? When was Jeremiah writing? Just before the Babylonian captivity. It was because of Israel's apostasy, which Jeremiah had lamented so much in the book, and in which he had said God was going to judge his people. He is going to judge them. He is going to bring the kingdom of Judah to a fall. He is going to take them away into exile. He is going to chastise them, but he is not going to cast them off. Many of you know Steve Herzig, who is with the Friends of Israel. He used to be ministering in Chicago, and one time at Northwestern University, the Friends of Israel put up a poster announcing a lecture on how to destroy the Jewish people. How to destroy. Now, Northwestern is right next to Skokie, which has a very, very large Jewish population in that section of the Chicago suburbs. And this poster announcing this topic really stirred up quite a storm. You have many people that still were there, that were living there, that still remembered World War II, remembered all that the Nazis had done to the Jewish people in Europe. So this was really an incendiary topic. And people packed the hall, and I don't know who was lecturing at the time, but he turned to this passage, and he says, do you want to destroy the Jewish people? Well, here's how you do it. Stop the sun from rising. Stop the stars from coming out at night. Destroy this fixed order of in the heavens, as God has said, and then the Jewish people will come to an end. But before then, until you do that, God has chosen his people. He has given them promises, and those promises are valid and still remain. So this passage is saying, in spite of apostasy, God will still keep his word to his people. He will not abrogate, bring to an end the Abrahamic covenant. Now, there's one other passage. I'm giving you 5 arguments. Can you give me 4 of them now? What did we start with last time? Yeah, but this is the argument. Why are we arguing? 5 arguments that it's an unconditional covenant. Okay, God ratified the covenant by himself. That's 1. No condition stated. That's 2. It's called an eternal covenant. That's 3. Even apostasy did not annul the covenant. Now there's one other passage. I want you to look at Hebrews chapter 6. Hebrews chapter 6 and verses 13 and following. Now why is this important? This is New Testament teaching that specifically relates to God's promises to Abraham. Now what did God say? What does the writer of Hebrews say about God's promises to Abraham? Look at, for when God made the promise to Abraham, since he could swear by no one greater, he swore by himself. He took an oath, swearing not on a Bible, but swearing by himself, since there's no one greater, saying, I will surely bless you, and I will surely multiply you. And thus, having patiently waited, he obtained the promise. For men swear by one greater than themselves, and with them an oath is given as confirmation, is an end of every dispute. Now, notice that phrase, an oath is given as confirmation. God was confirming to Abraham the truthfulness and the reliability of the promises that he was making to him. And he confirmed that by taking an oath. In the same way, God, desiring even more to show to the heirs of the heirs of the promise, what? The unchangeableness of his purpose. I'm making you these promises. I am not going to change the promises. I'm not going to go back on the promises. I'm not going to alter the promises. I am going to keep my word, and in order to confirm this to you, I will take an oath swearing by myself. He interposed with an oath, in order that by 2 unchangeable things, one is the oath, and the other is the fact that it is impossible for God to lie. Is that a pretty reliable basis for believing in the promises of God? We may have strong encouragement, we who have fled for refuge, in laying hold of the hope that is set before us. So, how could language be any stronger that God is going to keep the promises that he has made to Abraham, that he's not going to abrogate them, that Israel's unfaithfulness is not going to cause the promises to be changed or abrogated or the covenant to be annulled? How could you make that any stronger than what you have there in Hebrews 6? So that's 5 arguments for the fact that the Abrahamic covenant is an unconditional covenant. Now, one other point. And this is guaranteed to confuse some of you. This is our point of confusion, and it's this. There may be conditional aspects in an unconditional covenant. There may be conditional aspects to an unconditional covenant. Now, I've written this out so that you can look at it more than once if you are confused by what I am just saying here. And what I mean by this, even though the covenant itself is unconditional, faith or obedience may be still necessary for any individual to enjoy the blessings of the covenant. Now, why do I say that? If you look in John 8, you can see that the confidence of the Jews in the days of Jesus, where we have Abraham as our father. We're the children of Abraham. And they thought that because they were Abraham's seed, that the promises were guaranteed to them. Jesus said, you are Abraham's seed in one sense, but spiritually, you are of your father, the devil. And you really have no right to claim the promises, you as individuals. Now, what we're saying here is this is an unconditional covenant. It means that in the purpose of God, as far as God's purposes are concerned, this covenant is unconditional and is sure of its ultimate fulfillment. But no individual, no generation can automatically claim the promises for themselves. An individual can forfeit his place in the covenant by unbelief. An apostate generation may be driven out of the land and sent into exile. But here's the point. No unbelieving individual, no unbelieving generation can annul the covenant so that future generations do not have a right to trust in God and claim the promises. You see what I'm saying? An individual can forfeit his own place, but he cannot, like a king, abdicate the throne, and the descendants of a king who's abdicated the throne have no more right to the throne. The Abrahamic covenant will eventually be fulfilled, but it will be fulfilled by the believing descendants of Abraham, not by those in unbelief. Okay? You follow me on that? Okay? What's our thesis? Unconditional covenant. The unfulfilled promises of the unconditional covenant require premillennialism. Now, we've argued that the covenant is unconditional. Our next question is this: are there any promises in the Abrahamic covenant that have not yet been fulfilled? Are there any promises that have not yet been fulfilled? Remember, we said that there were promises to Abraham personally. Are there any promises that were given to Abraham personally that were not fulfilled in his lifetime? There were promises to Abraham's seed, his descendants. Are any of those promises still unfulfilled? That's the question that we are asking here. Now, first of all, promises to Abraham personally. One of the promises that is often overlooked in the Abrahamic covenant is that Abraham personally was promised the land. Do you remember when we read that? There was a verse in Genesis chapter 13. It's not in the initial verses of chapter 12, and so some people only read that first chapter. But in 13 and in verse 17, chapter 13 and 15, here in chapter 13 and verse 15, for all the land which you see, I will give it to you and to your descendants forever. Doesn't just say, I will give it to your descendants. He says, I will give it to you and to your descendants. Now, did God ever give Abraham the land that was promised to him? There are two verses in the New Testament that clearly answer that question, and you can look at them. The first is Acts chapter 7 and verse 5. Do you know who was speaking in Acts chapter 7? Stephen. This is Stephen's sermon in Acts chapter 7. And in verse 4, it says about Abraham that God removed him into this country in which you are now living. Where was Stephen? In Jerusalem. He says, God took Abraham and brought him into this country in which you are now living. And verse 5, and he gave him no inheritance in it, not even a foot of ground. And yet, even when he had no child, he promised that he would give it to him as a possession and to his offspring after him. What does it say? Not even a foot of ground was given of the land that God had promised to him. So, that's pretty clear, isn't it? That's an unfulfilled promise to Abraham personally. The other passage is Hebrews chapter 11 and verses 8 and 9 and 13. Hebrews 11. By faith, Abraham, when he was called, obeyed by going out to a place which he was to receive for an inheritance. And he went out not knowing where he was going. By faith, he lived as an alien in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, fellow heirs of the same promise. Then verse 13. All these died in faith without receiving the promises. Without receiving the promises. God made the promise that he would give them the land as an inheritance. That was their land. But they lived in it as aliens because it wasn't their land during their lifetime. They died in faith without receiving the promises, but having seen them and having welcomed them from a distance, and having confessed that they were strangers and exiles in the earth. Now, do you know what the evidence of this is in Genesis? This was the promised land to Abraham, right? When Abraham went to bury his wife, how much of the land did he actually own and possess to find a burial place for her? He didn't have any place. He didn't own any of it. He was an alien living in another land. He had to go and buy a burial plot in the land that God had promised to give him as an inheritance. Abraham personally never received the land that was promised to him. Any other promises not fulfilled? Did Abraham's seed receive the land promised to them? The answer to that is no. Abraham's seed, Abraham's descendants, never received the land that was promised to them. Now I'm making a very strong statement there, right? And there are two passages, two excellent passages that the amillennialist often will turn to and say, no, wait a minute, that's not right. Israel did receive the land. They did receive the promise. And I want you to look at those. First one is Joshua chapter 21 and verses 43 to 45. Joshua 21. And this really is an impressive passage if you are an amillennialist. Okay? What does verse 43 say? So the Lord gave Israel some of the land which he had sworn to give to their fathers. That's not what it says, right? What does it say? It says he gave them all of the land which he had sworn to give to their fathers, and they possessed it and lived in it. And the Lord gave them rest on every side according to all that he had sworn to their fathers, and no one of all of their enemies stood before them. The Lord gave all their enemies into their hand. Now look at verse 45. If I were an amillennialist, I really want to pound the pulpit at this point. What does verse 45 say? Not one of the good promises which the Lord had made to the house of Israel failed. All came to pass. That's strong language, right? How can I possibly say that Israel did not receive the land that had been promised to Abraham when you have verses that strong?
What about the passages that talk of the tribes or the peoples that were not conquered?
Okay, what about the passages that talk about the Canaanites that were not conquered? Now, it doesn't matter whether you're a premillennialist or an amillennialist. Really, when you read those verses in Joshua, when you just turn over a couple of pages to the beginning of the book of Judges, there's a problem. Here it says that all of the promises were fulfilled. What does Judges 1 say? Look at Judges 1:1. After the death of Joshua, the sons of Israel inquired of the Lord, saying, who shall go up first for us against the Canaanites, to fight against them? Why do they need to fight against the Canaanites if all of the land had been actually given to them? And then you go through, starting in verse 19, and these words ring over and over again. Now the Lord was with Judah, and they took possession of the hill country, but they could not drive out the inhabitants of the valley because they had iron chariots. You see what that is saying? There were some parts of the land that the Israelites never actually took possession of. And that happens over and over again. It says that they did not inherit this region and that region and so on. Now, how can Joshua say that all of the promises were fulfilled when there were still Canaanites in the land and there was a lot of the land that they never actually conquered and took possession of? How do you put those two things together? Do you see that that's not just anybody has that problem who believes that the Bible does not have contradictions in it.
Which promises are they referring to?
Well, it's referring to the promises of the land, right there at the beginning of Joshua, starting in verse 43. So it is referring to the promises of the land, and so on. Now, there is an answer to that. There's a scriptural answer to this, but we're going to have to wait until Friday.